In this video, we'll take a look at 7 of Bobby Fischer's finest games in the Sicilian defense, getting a glimpse at his tactical and strategic brilliance in this opening. The first opponent is Michels, and he starts e4. Fischer replies with c5, the Sicilian defense. The Sicilian is the most popular and best scoring response to White's first move, e4. c5 battles for the center, while gaining space on the queen side, creating a basis for future operations on this side of the board. White continues knight f3, planning a pawn break in the center, and black's d6 stops white from pushing e5 so that he can safely put his knight on f6. White pushes d4 to open the center, and black takes it, trading a flank pawn for a valuable central pawn. White recaptures, centralizing his knight, and black develops his knight to f6 with an attack on e4. White defends with knight c3 before black pushes a6, the Najdorf variation, which stops any of white's minor pieces from landing on b5, while also preparing a potential b5 pawn push himself at some point. Then white develops his bishop to d3, preparing to castle. Fischer follows with e6, opening his kingside bishop, and white cautiously decides to drop his undefended knight back to b3. Black develops his bishop to e7, and after white castles, he activates his queen onto c7. White also lifts his queen to e2, opening the square for one of his rooks to take over the semi-open d-file. Black develops his knight from b to d7, and after white brings his final minor piece out with bishop e3, black castles his king to safety. White's f3 solidifies his center pawn while preparing to shift the queen over to f2, creating a battery aimed at black's queenside. Black proceeds with b6, opening the square for his bishop, and white follows through with his plan of queen f2, creating a battery that builds up pressure on the b6 pawn. Still, the pawn is well defended, so black carries on development with bishop b7, and white slides his rook over from f to d1, targeting the slightly weak d6 pawn. Fischer continues activating his own pieces, placing his rook on the semi-open c-file, and white moves his own rook over from a to c1, believing there could be some action along the file. Yet after this slow move, black doesn't waste any time to push forward with b5, gaining space while trying to create enemy weaknesses on the queen side. To prevent further expansion, white plays a3 before black advances his knight to e5, now that it no longer needs to defend the pawn that was on b6. With the diagonal towards the king open, white shifts his king to the corner as he embraces his timidity in the face of his intimidating opponent. Fischer follows suit with king h8, but in this case, he's not taking a defensive stance, but instead an offensive posture, as his rook will soon shift to g8, after which his g-pawn will get rolling. White swoops his bishop to b6, tickling the queen, who calmly drops back a square. Then white lifts his rook to d2, preparing to double up on the d-file. And after black shifts his rook to g8, white moves his other rook from c to d1. Black launches his g-pawn with the intention of breaking open white's kingside. But with the dark squared diagonal opened up, white immediately places his bishop on d4, where it targets the black king. Black has little fear, however, lifting his rook to g6 with ideas of moving it to the h-file. White drops his queen to f1, creating a new battery aimed at black's queenside pawns, planning a4 to weaken them. Fischer's not worried about these ideas, as he starts turning his attention all towards the kingside with rook c to g1. White's a4 is met by a capture, and once the knight recaptures, black shifts his rook to h6, pressuring the h2 pawn. Now, although white can take the pawn on a6, it would be dangerous because black would exchange bishops, and after the queen would recapture, black would be able to play d5, opening his queen's indirect attack onto h2. Then the knight would be able to move anywhere, and the attack would be promising. So white avoids this by chopping the knight, forcing black to recapture with the pawn, after which the queen's diagonal will not open up anytime soon. Then, since the pawn on a6 isn't really going anywhere, white first reactivates his knight from the rim to c5 with an attack on the bishop. Fischer just presses on with g4, and his attack is nearing its climax. White grabs the bishop, black recaptures, and white snatches the pawn on a6 with an attack on the queen. She dodges to a7, where she stares down the white king side. Now black's plan is to reroute his queen to the other end of the board, and there just really isn't a good way for white to stop that. He waited a little too long and allowed black's attack to get a little too far along. He tries queen d3, defending the squares that the black queen could infiltrate. Fischer sets in motion his closing act with pawn takes f3. Now white should not take back with the pawn because otherwise the g-file would be opened up. Then black would jump his knight to h5, and there wouldn't be a way to stop it from getting to g3, which would force the king into discovered check territory on g2. Then a move like knight f1 check by the rook would force the king to capture the knight, after which queen g1, king e2, and rook takes h2 would be checkmate. Even if after black's knight h5, white were to try a move like rook g2, black would play knight g3 anyway. The rook would be forced to capture because the queen covers the g1 square, and then black would sacrifice his other rook on h2, forcing the king to capture, after which he would swoop his queen to f2, which would hit both the king and the rook. The king would have to retreat to h1 before black would pick up the rook. Then, to stop checkmate on g2, white would drop the queen to e2. Black would check on h3, forcing the queen to block, before checking on f3, which would force the queen to block again, where it would be captured with checkmate. Back to the game. White's best bet would be to capture the pawn with the queen, but that would hang the bishop. So he moves his knight to a5, looking to jump into c6. Fischer's eyes light up as he quickly seizes the opportunity to jump his knight to g4, with the glaring threat of knight f2, which would win material. With the knight, however, now in the rook's way, white decides to take the pawn on f3. And even though the game was already close to over, with that last move, white sped up his demise, as black now has an amazing way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 2? With 3 black pieces near the enemy king, all that's left is bringing in the most powerful one. The move Fischer plays to win the game is queen f2, and this move really is one that would leave most spectators in awe, including the opponent, who has no choice but to resign the game. The threat is rook takes pawn with checkmate, and there's no way to stop it except for taking the queen, which would lead to an even more aesthetic checkmate of knight takes f2, with the other rook cutting off the king's escape. The next opponent is Grandmaster Wolfgang Unzicker, and he opts for an open game against the Sicilian. Fischer takes the pawn, and after the knight recaptures, he develops his knight to f3, attacking e4. White defends with knight c3, and black plays a6, guarding the b5 square. Then white plays bishop e2, preparing to castle. Black lunges in the center with e5, kicking the knight back to b3, before he develops his bishop to e6, fighting for the d5 square. White castles, and black develops the knight from b to d7. White follows with the f4 pawn break, and in response, black plays queen c7, maintaining the tension, while planning to meet f5, which is white's next move, with bishop c4 thanks to the queen's help. White doesn't capture the bishop, because it would only activate black's queen, so he instead pushes a4 to hinder any black expansion on the queen side. Fischer develops his final minor piece with bishop e7 preparing to castle, and white brings his last minor piece out with bishop e3 looking at the weak b6 square. After black castles, white pushes a5, clamping down further on b6, so before it's too late, black pushes his b-pawn 2 squares to b5. Black's threatening b4, which would remove the defense of the e4 pawn, so white takes en passant, and although white does get the semi-open a-file, once black recaptures with the knight, he has ample support to push d5, which would get rid of his main weakness, which is the backwards d6 pawn. To stop that, white takes the knight, giving up his crucial dark-squared bishop, and black's queen recaptures with check, pushing the king to the corner. Black then drops his bishop back a square, with ideas of putting it on the long diagonal where it can support a d5 advance. But with most of white's pawns on light squares, white is happy to exchange light-squared bishops. Fischer recaptures with the pawn, eliminating his weak a pawn while fighting back for the open a file. White jumps his knight to d5, hitting just about everything, so black snatches it right away before the queen recaptures, adding an attacker to the rook in the corner. Black lifts it to a4, and white shouldn't take it because the pawn would recapture with an attack on the knight, who would leave the pawn on b2 hanging once it would move. Instead, in anticipation of black's rook f to c8, white plays c3, solidifying his pawn. Black shifts his queen over to a6, building up pressure down the a-file, and white proceeds with h3, cautiously giving his king air. Black moves his rook to the semi-open c-file, with ideas of doubling up on white's weak e-pawn. In anticipation, white shifts his rook from f to e1, defending. Fischer follows with h6, creating a flight square for his king. Now white doesn't really want to move any of his pieces. One rook guards e4 and the other battles for the open a-file. The knight protects the rook, and the queen is optimally placed in the center of the board. So he lifts his king to h2, getting off the back rank just in case of any tactics later on. Black, on the other hand, sees a way to improve as he advances his bishop to g5, gaining considerable scope along a new diagonal. White, afraid of a check on f4, plays g3, but this move just creates weaknesses around his king. Fischer immediately drops his queen to a7, looking to exploit the new openings on the second rank, and queen f2 check has to be stopped since it would win at least a pawn, but likely much more. So white shifts his king to g2, guarding the square. Then black finds the only move that fights for the advantage, rook a2. This threatens the pawn on b2, whose capture would come with a potent check and full control over the second rank. White's best bet would be to take the rook, and after the queen would recapture, white would have to defend his pawn with rook e2. Still, black would be able to win a pawn with rook takes c3, which would exploit the pin on the b pawn to the rook. In light of this, white drops his king to f1 so that the capture on b2 wouldn't come with check. Since black's rook is pinned to the queen, it can't take on b2 anymore. So white's plan is to take the rook on the next move, and then guard his pawn with the rook without worrying about a pin thanks to the king's defense of the rook. However, there's one crushing move that white is overlooking. Can you find black's one and only winning move? With the black queen staring at f2, and the rook looking at it indirectly, we notice that the pawn on b2 is pinned. The move Fischer plays to gain the decisive advantage is rook takes c3, and white, seeing no good way out, resigns the game. White cannot recapture the rook because queen to f2 would be checkmate with the other rook's support. However, black is also threatening rook f3 check, which would be devastating. White wouldn't be able to move the king to g2 because of queen f2 check, which would push the king to h1, after which rook takes g3 would be followed by an unstoppable checkmate of rook takes h3. The other option after rook to f3 would be king to e2, but that wouldn't work either because queen e3 would force the king to d1, where it would cut off the white rook's connection, and black could take the rook on a1, which would lure the knight to the corner. Then black would play queen c1 check, which would push the king back to e2, where it would be checked by the other rook, who would move to e3, and once the king would move, black would pick up the second rook, with a checkmate soon to follow. White would just have no good moves here to defend. Even taking the rook on a2 wouldn't be any good because despite stopping checkmate, black would move his rook to f3 with check, and once the king would move, he would play rook f2 check. It wouldn't matter where the king would move next, black would recapture the rook on a2. He would then win more pawns with dangerous threats to follow, all while white's king would still be in a seriously susceptible spot. The next opponent is someone who never has a good time against Fischer. Grandmaster Ruben Fine chooses to play an open game against the Sicilian, and when faced with the Najdorf, he plays bishop c5, pressuring the weak f7 point. Fischer applies e6, blunting the bishop's diagonal, and in anticipation of b5, white tucks the bishop away on b3. Black goes ahead with b5, gaining queenside space while opening the square for his bishop, and white plays queen e2, defending his own pawn in case of b4 kicking the knight. Black develops his bishop to e7, preparing to castle, before white launches his g-pawn, looking to immediately build up an attack on the king side. Black counters with b4, kicking the knight, and white chooses to retreat it back home in order to reroute it towards the center. Fischer takes this opportunity to strike in the center with d5 to get rid of his weak d-pawn. White retaliates by pushing the pawn, kicking the knight back to d7. Then he plays bishop f4, reinforcing his advanced pawn, before black's queen springs to b6 with an attack on the knight. White drops it back to f3, and black plays a5, opening the square for his bishop to develop, while threatening to trap the enemy bishop. White's bishop a4 blockades the pawn and pins the knight to the king, so black castles, getting his king away from the center. White follows with bishop e3, hitting the queen, so she drops to c7, adding an attacker to e5. After white moves his bishop to d5, defending the pawn, black lifts his bishop to a6, attacking the queen, who sidesteps to e3. Now Fischer played the opening to perfection. White's pieces are not well placed, and his king is still uncastled. Meanwhile, black's army is bursting with potential. He starts with knight c5, attacking the undefended bishop, who cannot move without getting trapped. Playing b3 here would just lead to a damaged pawn structure before black would win the pawn on c2. So white just takes the knight instead, and the bishop recaptures with an attack on the queen. Now white should move the queen. Black would continue with moves like knight c6, followed by f6 to open the f-file, and his position would be very good. Instead, white plays knight d4 self-pinning, and this gives black one move to win the game on the spot. Can you find black's winning move? It's no surprise that white putting his own knight into a pin was a bad idea, but he might be able to survive if it weren't for his lack of development and uncastled king. The move Fischer plays to finish up the game is queen b6, and white, seeing no way to save face, resigns. The knight has two attackers with no way to add defenders, and black will pick it up for free on the next move. White probably thought he could play c3, but this is why moving the queen to b6 was important. Black would take the pawn, and after white would recapture, black's queen would sprint to b2, where it would trap and win the rook in the corner. Black would gain a decisive material advantage. The fourth opponent is Bredov, and as usual we enter a Najdorf Sicilian, to which white replies with bishop e2. Fischer lunges in the center with e5, kicking the knight back to f3 before he develops his bishop to e7, preparing to castle. White swoops his bishop to g5, undermining black's control over d5, and black supports his knight by moving the other from b to d7. This does block the light-squared bishop, however, and white, thinking he's clever, jumps his knight to a4, looking to jump into f5. Black just pushes h6, and were the bishop to capture, the other would recapture, opening the light-squared bishop's defense of f5. So white preserves his bishop pair, retreating it to e3, and black jumps his knight to b6, opening his bishop, while building up pressure on d5 on the critical d5 square. White, realizing his knight's not doing anything on the rim, clumsily drops it back to f3. Fischer develops his final minor piece with bishop e6, and white castles. With the support of his bishop, black jumps his knight to c4, hitting both the bishop and the pawn on b2. White is reluctant to drop his bishop back defending, so he snaps off the knight with his other bishop, and white recaptures, hitting the rook. After it shifts the square to e1, black castles, and white drops his knight to d2, hitting the bishop while making way for his f-pawn to advance. Black retreats the bishop before white strikes with f4, and although this move looks threatening, it does create serious kingside weaknesses that white may not have completely thought through. Fischer captures the pawn, luring the bishop away from its king's diagonal once it recaptures. Black follows with queen b6 check, forking the king and the pawn on b2. White sidesteps his king to the corner, and black wins the pawn with an attack on the now hanging knight. White jumps his knight to d5, which looks like it loses a pawn, as white captures the knight, and after the pawn recaptures, he takes that too. However, white is able to play knight c4, hitting the queen and the pawn on d6 for a second time, while opening up an attack on the knight by the queen. Black's only move is queen b5, saving his queen and defending the knight. This is followed by knight takes d6, winning back the pawn while hitting the queen again. Fischer drops his queen to c6, attacking the knight, who jumps to f5, adding a second attacker to the bishop. It moves to f6, hitting the rook in the corner, so white blocks with bishop e5. Black slides his rook over from a to d8, indirectly hitting the queen, and white's queen springs to g4, building up what appears to be a menacing attack. Black must be very careful here. He grabs the bishop on e5, and after the rook recaptures, he slides his queen over to f6, defending against the checkmate threat by white's queen and knight. White swings his other rook over from a to e1, saving his rook and doubling up on the e-file. And black drops his knight to c7, preparing to reroute it to e6 to solidify his king side, which would put an end to white's attack. With black's precise defense, white sees no breakthrough, as he moves his queen to e4, going for material instead. Black leaves his pawn on b7 hanging as he jumps his knight to e6, and white gleefully grabs it, believing all is well. Little does he know, the pawn was poisoned, and black has a marvelous move to win the game. Can you find the black's winning move? To find the move, one must notice that the rook on e1 is overloaded, defending both the back rank and the other rook. The move Fischer plays to exploit this is queen takes e5, and white, realizing it's all over, resigns the game. Black just won a full rook, which is a decisive material advantage, and were white to take the queen, then black's rook d1 would lead to a back rank checkmate. The fifth opponent is Mladen Matov, and he meets Fischer's favorite Sicilian, the Najdorf, with bishop g5 pressuring the knight on f6 right away. Fischer replies with e6 so that he can recapture the knight with his queen were it to be captured. White follows in aggressive fashion with f4, and black develops his bishop to e7. After white's bishop e2, black plays queen b6, targeting the hanging b2 pawn. Now, a move like b3 would create serious dark square weaknesses on the queen side, and while white could save his pawn with knight b3, black's queen would be well placed on the diagonal where it stops white from castling. Instead of both of these, white plays queen d2, letting black win a pawn. In return, he will get a huge lead in development and great attacking potential. He starts with rook b1, taking the semi-open file with an attack on the queen, who sidesteps to its only available square on a3. Then he gets his king castled to safety. Fischer calmly proceeds development with knight b to d7 before white lunges with f5. This opens the e5 square, however, and black's knight leaps ahead to a more active post. White cautiously shifts his king to the corner out of any potential attacks along the diagonal, and black also acknowledges his king's security by castling. White lifts his rook to b3, where it attacks the queen, but also has the option long-term to slide over to the king side. Black retreats her to c5, and white wants to move his knight on c3, but it would hang the e4 pawn. So he first grabs the knight on f6, and after black recaptures with the bishop, he jumps his knight to a4, where it hits the queen. White is hoping the queen would retreat, after which he could jump his knight to b6, possibly taking the bishop at some point to weaken black's defense of the e6 pawn. However, white's plan is fatally flawed, all because of one move. Can you find black's only winning move? The queen is under attack, but she doesn't need to move, as black can make a more serious threat. The move Fischer plays to win the game is knight c4. Now white cannot take black's queen because black would then take white's queen, after which both of the white knights would be hanging, and both of the white rooks would be under attack. White would inevitably lose material. The problem for white is that he must save his queen, but the white knight on d4 is also hanging with an attack by the queen, and with the knight out of the way, the bishop as well. There's no way to save the piece, and in the game, white moves his queen to f4. Black grabs the knight, going up a piece, and it's just all over. White plays a few more moves, starting with rook d3. Black sidesteps his queen to e5, offering an exchange, which white rejects. Then black takes the pawn on f5, enticing white to recapture with the pawn, which opens the black queen's defense of e3. Black jumps his knight to e3, where it forks the queen and the rook, leading to the win of even more material. This is when black calls it a day and resigns the game. The penultimate opponent is Grandmaster Robert Byrne, and this game, like most of Fischer's Sicilians, is a Najdorf, to which white replies bishop c4. Fischer blunts the bishop's diagonal with e6, and white drops the bishop back to b3 in anticipation of black's next move, b5. White immediately expands in the center with f4, and black puts his bishop on b7, adding an attacker to the e4 pawn. White counters with f5, threatening to take twice on e6. So black closes things up with e5, hitting the knight, who retreats to e2. Black carries on development with knight b to d7, and white pins the black knight to its queen with bishop g5. Black breaks the pin with bishop e7 before white reroutes his knight towards the king side, starting with the g3 square. Fischer slides his rook over to the semi-open c-file, and after white castles, he pushes h5, showing his disinclination to castle, instead opting for an aggressive attack. White stops further expansion with h4, and black turns the attention to the other end with b4, hitting the knight in order to remove the defense of the e4 pawn. Now the knight could jump to d5, but black would take it, opening the dark squared bishops to one another. White wouldn't be able to take that because the knight would recapture, winning a piece. So he would have to take the knight back, after which black would take twice on g5, winning a pawn. To avoid all of this, white takes the knight on f6, and black recaptures with the bishop, hitting the h4 pawn. Then white jumps his knight to d5, hitting the bishop, who grabs the pawn on h4, before white takes the pawn on h5 with his knight in exchange. The knight, however, is in a tight spot, and Fischer advances his queen to g5, hitting it for a second time. White cleverly pushes his pawn to f6, planning to meet a capture of the knight with the queen, with pawn takes g7, hitting the rook, who would be stuck choosing between the defense of the queen and the promotion of the pawn. Otherwise, taking the knight with the rook would result in rook f5, skewering the queen and rook. So, black pushes g6, hitting the knight, and it jumps to g7 with check. The king sidesteps to d8. Now black's planning to take the knight, removing the defense of the e3 square before jumping his queen onto e3, which would push the king to h1, after which there would be devastating discovered checks by the rook and bishop. So white lifts his rook to f3, guarding the d3 square from the black queen. Fischer moves his bishop to g3 with the king hunt on the horizon. After white lifts his queen to d3, adding an attacker to the bishop, black checks on h2, kicking the king to f1. Then he advances his knight to c5, hitting the queen. White counters with rook h3, threatening black's rook with check, and while black could probably get away with taking the queen, he decides to play it safe with rook h4, saving his rook while preparing to swing it over along the fourth rank. White saves his queen, moving her to f3, and here's where Fischer begins setting up his final combination. He starts by taking the bishop, removing the defense of the c2 square. Then he takes the rook, and white should avoid taking it with the pawn because it would allow queen g1, which would skewer and win the other rook. So white has to capture with the queen, weakening the defense of the f6 pawn. There is one move left to put everything into place, and in this case, it's the only winning move. Can you find black's best move? Black's rook is going to take the pawn on c2 at some point, and the only other thing he needs to do is get his queen to the f-file to begin his attack on the king. The move Fischer plays to seal the deal is bishop takes d5, removing the defense of the f6 pawn. Now white could take the bishop on h2, but it wouldn't change much. In the game, he recaptures the bishop on d5, and black takes the pawn on f6 with check, winning one pawn. The king shifts over to e1, and black's final move is queen f4, prompting white to resign the game. Black's threat, and to show it, we'll just move the knight to e8, is bishop g3, which would push the king to d1, followed by queen f1, kicking the king to d2. Queen f2 check would push the king to d3, after which queen d4 check would force the king to e2, where it would get checked by the rook once it would capture on c2. Finally, after the king would go to f3, queen f4 would be checkmate. Back to the game. The best way for white to stop this would be queen f3, and black doesn't even need to exchange queens, and he would still have a promising attack. But to make things simple, he could trade queens because the knight on g7 would be trapped. He would finish up the game by marching his king over to munch the knight, which would give him a decisive material advantage. The final opponent is Grandmaster Andreas Duyckstein, and he leads the game into an open Sicilian, but recaptures the pawn on d4 with his queen instead of his knight. Fischer develops his knight to c6, hitting the queen, so white swoops his bishop to b5, pinning it to its king. After black breaks the pin, white chops the knight, and black recaptures with the bishop. White proceeds development with knight c3, and black brings his knight out to f6. Bishop g5 has ideas of damaging the black pawn structure by capturing, so black pushes e6, opening the queen's defense of the knight. After white castles, black plays bishop to e7, preparing to do the same. Rook a to d1 centralizing the rook is met by black castling, before white puts the other rook on e1, getting good control over the center. Fischer launches his queen to a5, opening the d8 square for one of his rooks. It also pressures the bishop, so to avoid any potential tactics, white cautiously drops it back to h4. Black brings his rook over from f to d8, and with ideas for white to bring the knight towards the center, white moves his queen back to d3, vacating the d4 square. Black swings his queen all the way over to the king side, tying the knight down to the defense of the bishop. White follows by lifting his rook to e3, preparing to swing it over to contest the king side, and black activates his last piece with rook a to c8. At this moment, white captures the knight on f6, allowing his knight to move freely, and after black recaptures with the bishop, white jumps his knight to a more active square on d4. Fischer prudently plays g6, giving his king heir, and white starts maneuvering his knight towards the king side with knight c to e2. However, this weakens control over the d5 square, and black seizes the opportunity to strike with d5. White inserts knight g3, hitting the queen, and she slides over to e5, building up pressure on the knight. The threat now is to take the pawn on e4, opening up a third attacker onto the knight, namely the rook. So white plays c3, securing his knight, and black still takes the pawn. While white could take the pawn back, black would take the knight, and after the rook would recapture, black would shift his queen to d5, creating a potent pin on the knight to the queen. Then a move like e5, piling up on the pinned piece, would be dangerous. White avoids all of this by dropping his queen back to e2, planning to recapture the pawn later. Fischer moves his queen to d6, creating a battery that pins the knight to the rook, and the threat again is e5. In response, white plays rook d2, getting his rook off the back rank so that he can meet e5 with either knight b3 defending the rook, or even knight takes c6, planning to meet the black's capture of the rook with a capture of black's rook on d8. However, there is one move that white is overlooking that gives black the advantage. Can you find black's winning move? To find the move, one must notice that the two white rooks are on the same diagonal. The move Fischer plays to exploit this is bishop g5, and black's going to win the exchange no matter what white does next. In the game, he plays knight b3, opening the rook's attack onto the queen, but after black plays queen e5, white throws in the towel and resigns the game. Even if white were to take the rook on d8, black would recapture, and the rook on e3 would be trapped with nowhere to go. Black's going to pick it up next, winning the exchange, along with the extra pawn he already has. This would be a decisive advantage. Keep in mind that white cannot actually take the pawn on e4, because once all the exchanges would be made, white's back rank would be left defenseless, and black would swoop his rook down with a checkmate soon to follow. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.